Hello, everyone, and welcome to our final event of this two-day conference, Statistic Border Crossings in and Beyond Translation. And in this roundtable, we'll be talking about influence in Slavic contexts, and we have three speakers today. I will introduce them each and ask each to say a few words about their take on influence in Slavic context. So with sort of thinking about this panel as a way to discuss freely and look into this, into the interaction between Russian literature in the West, something that's there's been an increasing number of publications about recently, but think about it from a concrete, where possible, and stylistic perspective, both thinking about how Western influence has impacted Russian literature and vice versa, directly and through translation as well. So I will first of all give the floor to Leonid Livak. Leonid is professor of Russian literature in the University of Toronto's Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures and the Anton Baum Center for Jewish Studies as well. He is the author of multiple books, including the well-received How It Was Done in Paris, Russian Emigre Literature and French Modernism, The Jewish Persona in the European Imagination, A Case of Russian Literature, Russian Emigres in the Intellectual and Literary Life of Interwar France, a bibliographical essay, and most recently In Search of Russian Modernism in 2018. Leonid's research interests include French and Russian literature and cultures in the 19th and 20th centuries, modernist studies, Jewish studies, comparative approaches to literary and cultural studies. And Leonid, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation to this roundtable. So I will limit my remarks to brief answers to your questions. So the first question that you sent out to panel participants was, how have stylistic features crossed over from texts written in other languages into Russian literary texts or vice versa? So the most immediate example that I can think of comes from Russian literary works created in the 1920s and 1930s in France, that is to say, by Russian immigrant writers who forged for themselves kind of a European rather than a straightforward Russian literary identity, and wanted to be read by other Russian emigres, since their books were not at the time allowed in the USSR. They wanted to be read as Russian Europeans. Now, they certainly have a plethora of choices of European models of the day, but interestingly enough, most ambitious young Russian writers chose as their model Marcel Proust, specifically because it was possible for them to be identified as quote-unquote Proustians thanks to stylistic borrowings from what at this moment in the 1920s was perceived as the Proustian style. Rightly or wrongly, that's another question. But there was enough critical discourse around the recent publication of Proust's novels in French, critical discourse both in French and Russian, to justify certain stylistic practices in Russian and to have those practices marked as Proustian. So there are at least three young at the time authors who come to mind. That is Gaita Gazdanov with his first Russian novel published in 1929, An Evening with Claire. Then there was Yuri Felzin. His novel also was published in 1929, Deceit. And finally, Vladimir Nabokov, who published two novels in the 30s, Camera Obscura in 1932, written 32, published slightly later, and The Gift, serialized in 37-38, both of which engage with the problem of Proustian style in Russian prose. So that is really the closest that, to my recollection, one can find one comes to in terms of straightforward stylistic borrowing from one language to another. Because this Proustianism in Russian modernist prose was, strictly speaking, a stylistic borrowing, and first and foremost, syntactic borrowing. So this allows me to transition to your second question, which is as follows. Well, it is common knowledge that stylistic influence of other languages and literatures have shaped Russian literature in important ways. To what extent and by which methods can it be pinned down? Well, of course, a specialist in 19th century Russian literature would immediately speak about the Arzamas circle around Karamzin in the early 19th century, which programmatically built new Russian literary language on vocabulary borrowings from French. Because it was, at the time, it was assumed that Russian literary language was too obsolete and too indebted to Old Church Slavonic, so that mundane phenomena did not have any words for their description, and so we had to borrow from the French, and that was the problem. Whereas in the 20th century, to come back to the examples I've already cited, the borrowings were not vocabularies, they were actually syntactic. So that if we speak about Gaita Gazdanov's novel An Evening with Claire, there is an in-your-face, deliberate, elongated phrase, long periods that can run into about half a page, which was extremely atypical for high Russian modernism beginning in the 1910s. So a deliberate long periods with numerous clauses, subordinate clauses, and what was especially typical of this so-called Proustian style, numerous parenthetical digressions inserted within those subordinate clauses. What's interesting about comparing Gazdanov's take on what should be stylistic Proustianism and, let's say, Yuri Felzin's is that Gazdanov's periods can be very easily broken up into autonomous sentences. He simply chains them. He links them by means of mostly punctuation. Whereas, and by the way, later he admitted that he actually had not read any of Proust's prose before writing An Evening with Claire. In other words, his idea of what constitutes a Proustian style came from critical debates about Proust's novels in the 1920s, both French and Russian. Whereas Yuri Felzin, his contemporary, who publishes his own quote-unquote Proustian novel at this very time in 1929, works clearly, he works with Proust's novels. He studies the Proustian phrase, and his period, which is also long, which is also made up of numerous subordinate clauses and parenthetical digressions, his period is impossible to break up. It is structured syntactically in such a way that by trying to break them up, there is some semantic loss. Just like in Proust, it is impossible to actually partition those long periods into smaller ones. There will be some loss in meaning because of the necessary involvement of the active reader, especially the engagement with the reader's memory. Because in order to consume that longer period, one has to train one's memory. So this was the principle of Felzin's building of what he conceived of as the Proustian period. Whereas if we look at Nabokov, then for Nabokov, it's already kind of a parody, a pastiche of what is critically built up as the Proustian phrase, both in Camera Obscura and in The Gift. Nabokov lets us know that he is fully aware of this practice in Russian prose, this Russian Proustianism, and this practice for him is already passé. It is something that is too fashionable for him to seriously use. And so he parodies. There are several passages, both in Camera Obscura and in The Gift, where he shows us that he can build what is perceived by Russian readers as the Prussian phrase, but he refuses to accept it as a valid stylistic device in Russian prose. It is too popular. So your next question, can stylistic characteristics be actually transferred or reproduced between literary traditions in different languages? Well, yes and no, because if we take specific examples, and your question immediately brought up in my mind the example of Lyudmila Savitskaya, known in French as Lyudmila Savitsky, a very prolific translator who was active in France in the 1920s and 30s. So Lyudmila Savitskaya translated into French from both English and Russian. She was the first translator of Joyce into French, but she was also very active in translating early Russian modernist poetry and prose into French. It so happened that in the early 20s, Savitskaya was translating A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man at the very time as she was translating the poetry and prose of Constantin Balmont. So that, if you will, there was a kind of a disjunction in a way, because on the one hand, she is translating early Russian modernist prose and poetry. On the other hand, she is translating high modernist British, well, let's say Anglophone, high modernist Anglophone prose. However, what's curious in that case is that the reception in France of those translations was very similar. When she submitted the manuscript of A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man to the French publisher who commissioned the translation, at the same time as she submitted the manuscript of a volume of Constantin Balmont's poetry and prose, Vision Solaire, to another French publisher, the reaction was similar. It was, what is this? This is not French style. This is not French prose. This is not French poetry. You probably don't know French well enough. This was a response to Savitsky's translations, a suspicion that she was not, well, and indeed, she was not a native speaker of French. She was very well fluent in French. But the fact that she tried to emulate in French the style of A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and the style of Balmont's travelogues in prose was enough for the French reader, an educated French reader, to say that actually this is a bad translation. It is not a faithful translation, it's a bad translation. This is not how a French writer would structure a sentence. And it took Savitsky about a year of essentially threatening the French publishers to withdraw the manuscripts and to find other publishers to convince them to accept it the way she translated it. And when A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man came out finally in French, it was translated under the title Dédalus. The reception was, well, for lack of a better word, ecstatic. No one had ever written in French this way. But the pushback is also quite significant. So come back to your question, can stylistic characteristic be actually transferred or reproduced between literary traditions? Yes and no. On the one hand, of course, the translator is free to try and approximate as best she can. On the other hand, the reception of such a translation, which is not an adaptation, but an actual translation, is always problematic, at least in my experience. Another example is Vladimir Nabokov's self-translations, because when Nabokov translates from Russian into English his Camera Obscura, it is clear that he feels that he cannot translate faithfully, he has to adapt. And so he actually essentially rewrites his text. It's a text that is very far stylistically from what he wrote in Russian. And you can say the same about Nabokov's self-translation in the case of Lolita, where when he translates himself from English into Russian, he actually conducts a kind of stylistic self-exegesis. It is not just a translation. He is trying to translate in such a way when he actually explains to a bilingual reader what that reader might have missed in the English original of the novel. So that the Russian volume is not a translation, it's an annotation of the English original. So that's what I wanted to say. These are my brief
remarks. Thank you so much for this very perceptive and fascinating remarks. And I'm sure we'll pick up on a lot of these issues very shortly. And to begin with, I would pick up on the difference you made between between Bogdanov, who didn't read Proust, and Fedorov, who did, between the stylistic influence through translation, through the medium of translation, and without it, by passing on the floor to the next speaker, Brian Baer, who is professor of Russian and Translation Studies at Kent State University. Brian is founding editor of the journal Translation and Interpreting Studies and co-editor of the Bloomsbury book series Literatures, Cultures, Translation with Michelle Woods, and of the Routledge book series Translation Studies in Translation with Yifan Zhu. He publishes widely on translation history, translation pedagogy, and translation theory. His most recent publications include the monographs Translation and the Making of Modern Russian Literature, and Queer Theory and Translation Studies, Language, Politics, Desire, the collected volumes Research in Translation and Interpreting with Claudia Angelelli, Translation in Russian Context with Susanna Witt, and Queer in Translation, Translating the Queer with Klaus Kaindl, as well as the Translations Culture, Memory and History Essays in Cultural Semiotics by Juri Lotman, and Introduction to Translation Theory by Andrei Fedorov. He is current president of the American Translation and Interpreting Studies Association and sits also on the International Advisory Board of the Mona Baker Center for Translation Studies at Shanghai International Studies University. And I don't know what you'd like to talk about, Brian, anything you think is relevant, but I sort of was thinking that your recent book on translation and the making of modern Russian literature might be one potential place to start in this context. You take it where you want.
Yes, thank you. So I thought I'd use my allotted time to just introduce a few ways to think about the question of influence or stylistic influence in particular in Slavic context from a translation or even translation studies perspective. So one way, of course, is in the context of an individual author. And in fact, when I started thinking about this panel, I was reminded of an essay written by Andrei Fedorov in the post-Soviet period in the 1990s, reflecting on his participation in the translation project of rendering Proust into Russian for the first time under the direction of the great philological translator Adrian Frankovsky. And that project began in the mid-20s. They were able to publish volumes up through the 30s, in fact, and the volume La Prisonnière was in proofs in 1941, and that publication was stopped. The proofs were destroyed, and Proust definitively became persona non grata in the Soviet Union, although he had been criticized, of course, with increasing vehemence throughout the 1930s as a modernist. In any case, Fedorov writes in that essay that they took great pains to preserve the lengthy sentences of Proust's writing, not because those sentences were French, but because they were Proustian. And I think this also suggests, raises the whole question of Venuti's foreignization, right? To do it because they're French suggests a kind of linguistic fetishization, whereas most stylistic influences come on the backs of great writers when the translator is inspired to try to replicate somehow their style in the target language. But there's also a kind of meta way to approach this problem. And this was raised already in 1920 by Fyodor Batsushkov in his introduction to the Principles of Literary Translation, co-authored with Kornei Chukovsky and Nikolai Gumilyov. And in that introduction, he writes that there are basically three models of translation as stylistic borrowing. And one of them is when the source culture sees itself as superior to the target culture. In the case of, when the target culture sees itself as superior to the source culture, and he uses France in the 17th and 18th centuries, and the literature they borrowed, of course, was radically domesticated. The other model where the target culture sees itself inferior to the source culture is represented by Russia in the 18th century, where translations were characterized by wild, unsystematic borrowings of both stylistic structures and lexis. And then the third model, which he hopes Russia is now capable of practicing, is when the two cultures see themselves as more or less equivalent in terms of their spiritual development, as he puts it, and so they can attempt to render both the form and the content. So this is also an interesting way to think about stylistic influences in a way that predates similar models introduced by Casanova and others decades later. Another way, of course, though, another model is political. And in the 20s and 30s in the Soviet Union, translation was seen as a viable site of stylistic borrowing. And this occurs up through the mid-1930s. And there was a volume, in fact, on Francuska Lírica, and the introduction lists this as a legitimate approach of borrowing foreign structures and phrases into the target language. And in fact, Fedorov in his 1930 Art of Translation says the same thing. This is a legitimate strategy to create new forms in the target language to reflect source text structures and lexis. By the late 30s, this becomes impossible, and the reigning orthodoxy is you must not violate the integrity of the target language, in this case, Russian. So everything must be relegated to the norms of contemporary Russian. So obviously this is tied to the campaign against formalism, etc. But this becomes in Fedorov in 1953, he must say every time, that the translator has a certain degree of agency, but must not in the end violate the integrity, the norms of the Russian language. And there's also a kind of supra-individual aspect to stylistic borrowing. Leonid mentioned Karamzin, and Karamzin gave advice to many of his contemporaries, and specifically contemporary translators, on how to render foreign concepts and terms, especially from the French. Many of his prescriptions, which were often calques, I would say most of them were not accepted. So he had good reasons for suggesting them, but there's a cultural logic at play in the end, which determines which borrowings or not get accepted and become integrated into the target language. And of course, Tolstoy raises this whole question in the very opening paragraphs of Vaina i Mir, when he talks about how one of the characters uses the word grippe, borrowed from the French, but now already in Cyrillic, already used without the French la. And so there are degrees of incorporation. And again, some terms are rejected and others accepted, but again, for supra-individual reasons, which we often cannot fathom. And finally, I would argue for the importance of moving beyond binaries in our thinking about stylistic influences. And I think Leonid's work, of course, dealing with this third émigré culture in France, suggests the importance of non-binary models. But in my own writing, translation work too, years ago, I was translating the work of an obscure Ukrainian woman writer, Lyubov Krychevskaya, who wrote in Russian. She was first cousin of the great Ukrainian writer Kvitka Osnavyanenka. And in some of her prose writings, she seemed very influenced, in my opinion, by Jane Austen. Often they feature two sisters, one serious and dark-haired, one frivolous and light-haired, and this kind of thing. And so I started to investigate the Russian reception of Jane Austen, and was surprised to see that she wasn't translated into Russian until the 1960s. And so then I start to think, were there other ways Krychewska might have encountered literature of this kind? And it turns out there was a very prolific and influential French translator of Austen, Isabelle de Montalon. She was Swiss, and her translations were extremely sentimentalizing. And so that made much more sense that Krychewska might have come across Austen through these radically sentimentalizing translations by Montalon, because Krychewska's writings had none of the dry wit of Austen, and which was also absent in de Montalon's translations. And it reminds me of a recent publication by Pierre Bologne about the reception of Russian literature in Europe, and specifically about Nietzsche's encounter with Dostoevsky. And it turns out that the Dostoevsky that Nietzsche read was this kind of bastardized volume created in French of an early writing, The Landlady, which was mashed together with pieces of notes from the underground without the preface and given a new title. So when we talk about Nietzsche's engagement with Dostoevsky, I mean, I think it's super important that we recognize in what form did he encounter Dostoevsky. And so luckily there's been in the last few years enormous amount of writing on what we call indirect or relay translation, which is a really circuitous route by which influences enter other languages. And I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Brian. And I'll then just, without further ado, move on to our last speaker, Nila Friedberg. And Nila has a PowerPoint, so let's have that on screen. And Nila is Associate Professor of Russian at Portland State University. Her interests include linguistic approaches to literature, language contact, 20th century Russian poetry, and poetics and Russian Jewish literature. She is the author of English Rhythms in Russian Verse on the Experiment of Joseph Brodsky, and a monograph which investigates the English flavor in Joseph Brodsky's verse and traces the semantic associations of English-sounding, quote-unquote, rhythms in Brodsky's Russian poetry. She's also a co-editor with Ellen Drescher of the volume Formal Approaches to Poetry, published by Mouton de Gruyter 2006. She received her PhD in linguistics from the University of Toronto and was a postdoctoral fellow at the UCLA Slavic department between 2002 and 2004. At Portland, she teaches or has taught Russian phonetics and phonology, languages of the world, all levels of Russian for heritage speakers, poets, and politics, 20th and 19th century Russian literature in Russian, and so on and so forth. She has previously taught Russian at the Middlebury College Russian School and UCLA, taught linguistics and phonetics at the University of Toronto and York University in Canada, and serves as a coordinator of the Heritage Russian program at Portland State University. And I guess we have today very different speakers in many ways with different research backgrounds and perspectives. And Nila's, I think, is in contrast to the previous two perspectives, offers a more empirical, perhaps, approach to stylistic transfer. And I was very impressed when I first read Nila's book on Brodsky, partly because I'm very interested in Brodsky, but also because it seemed to be, I've never really come across a similar approach to a very specific engagement with trying to really track where style has been transferred in a case where, like, we know Brodsky was influenced, he's claimed he's been influenced by English poetics, but trying to really track it down to something specific and concrete. So Nila, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I will start with Billy Bragg. In one of his songs, he says, "The temptation to take the precious things we have apart to see how they work must be resisted, for they never fit together again." And I'm going to deviate from this advice and really not follow Billy Bragg's advice. I think that taking things apart can be useful And in fact, it can explain influence, or whether it's influence or typological similarity, and it can explain both translation and stylization. And I will start with the first question from Eugenia. What methods are useful? And in my own work, I used a variety of methods, and one of them was what they call the Russian, or we actually should be calling it the Soviet statistical approach to verse, where tendencies in rhythm are analyzed in terms of very specific numbers, and researchers really count how many times certain positions receive stress, how many times we use a certain kind of rhyme, and so on. And it had an impact on on verse studies outside of the Soviet Union, and we saw this in the works of Jerry Smith, James Bailey, and many others. The second approach I used was the North American generative metrics, as developed by Holly and Kaiser and Paul Kiparsky and Bruce Hayes. And what I found is that some phenomena in Russian verse, for example, when a poet swallows a certain syllable, the syllable is there, but you don't count it. Russian methods didn't really have anything to say about it. And what you needed is precisely the approach that was developed in North America. And finally, the third approach that I found very useful is the study of the connection between meter and meaning, or in other words, semantic halo, because that explains why sometimes transfer of features from one language to the other doesn't happen. Anyway, so I will move on, and I will talk about Brodsky today. Unfortunately, Brodsky has been used by current propagandists, and perhaps I think one reason, of course, is the unfortunate part of his past when he wrote a poem against Ukraine. But Brodsky wrote many things, and I think we need to look into kind of the full picture, and really also what is his narrative voice, rather than the narrative voice of someone else that he uses. So what I'm going to show today metrically, that clearly he is not Nash. He really is a mix, and he always has been. Can stylistic characteristics be transferred between traditions? And what I found in metrical research is that the transfer is typically really partial, and what we get is a hybrid or a non-transfer. One example is syllabic meter, right? We know that syllabic meter, syllable counting meter, has been borrowed into Russian from Polish models. And one interesting case in this respect is Pushkin's Tale of the Fisherman and the Fish. There were a lot of debates about that meter, and many suggested that it was influenced by Serbo-Croatian epic decasyllable, that inspired also Pushkin's songs of the Western Slavs. And when we look at the actual text, we see that it doesn't quite work, right? Because epic decasyllable assumes 10 syllables, but in Pushkin text, we have 9. And what other people suggested is that maybe this text really has sources in tonic verse, in accentual verse, in the folk tradition. But it wasn't quite clear how you make it work, because there were many exceptional lines, and the folk model didn't work either. So what I am suggesting in my forthcoming paper, this is a paper on versification for Oxford Handbook of Russian poetry, is that Pushkin uses a phonological constraint, no clash, where if you have clashing stressed syllables, one of them is just not counted, it becomes weaker. And in Russian, it's not really operative very much. In English, that constraint is very operative. For example, when you say 13 men, 2 clashing syllables don't work. So instead, people shift stress and say 13 men, right? So in some languages, this constraint is very active. In other languages, it's really obscure. And here is an interesting point that Pushkin blends the folk tradition with the syllabic tradition from Serbian and Croatian. But in order to see that the folk tradition is represented there metrically, you need to use this constraint, which is really obscure in Russian. And you really need to know about the phonologies of world languages in order to analyze this text. Now, another instance of transfer, which I already mentioned, is when a poet swallows, no, not swallows, when in a meter, certain positions which you expect to be stressed are unstressed. It's very common in Russian. And an example given here is from Pushkin, "И лучше выдумать не мог." So we have a line which we call iambic tetrameter, and yet one syllable is unstressed. So Russian verse has a certain way of doing it. Our words are really long. We don't have enough words to fill iambic lines properly. And because of the long words, in certain cases, we skip those stressed syllables. And usually our third position in iambic tetrameter receives stress from 53 to 34% of the time. That has been calculated by Gasparov. Now, let's look at English. That position, the same position, is usually receiving stress from 75 to 91% of the time, because there are there are a lot of monosyllabic stressed words, and you just need to fit them in. And Brodsky is doing something interesting here. So he clearly is not a Russian in that respect, because even if you compare him to Tsvetaeva that he adored, who violated the Russian tendency for stressing in iambic meter, and for her, second position was like much lower than for most poets. She still was 53% in that third position, and Brodsky was higher. So he's somewhere in between Tsvetaeva and English, right? He again creates a hybrid meter, which is neither English nor Russian. Now, swallowing syllables, another thing I looked at. We know that in English verse, sometimes you have lines like, and quite divorce his memory from his part, when memory is scanned as a two-syllabic word, not a trisyllabic word. And there are ways of doing it in English verse. Linguists like Kiparsky explained what kinds of consonants should be there so you could do it, what kinds of vowels should be there. And he noticed that one case is like envious or annual. Those words are often scanned as disyllabic, and it happens when you have short E or short U. And here you go, when you look at Brodsky, he has that rule in Russian. He sometimes squeezes two syllables, kind of swallows one of them, and one line is from Новые станции к Августе, дождь стягивает просвет, where G is kind of not counted metrically. And when I looked at a really large sample of his poetry, it turned out to be E and U, just like English. The difference, though, is that in English, those were phonemic, contrastive, short E and U. In Russian, doesn't have contrastive length. So he modified the rule, but the rule was incredibly similar to English. Anyway, next question was, how does stylistic influence compare to stylistic influence through translation? Is translation similar to stylization? When you look at Brodsky and how he distributes his stresses in iambic poetry, one thing I noticed is that he violates the Russian tendency. And for Russian tendency in rhythm, you like this alternating pattern. So if you skip stress on a third syllable in tetrameter, then on a second, you won't skip it as much. And on the first, you will skip it more. So it's a wave-like pattern, which he violates in his poetry, but in very specific contexts. So one context is exile, right? So when we look at the numbers here, 57 is less than 60, right? And the normal distribution would be to have S2 position higher than S3. So he violates it in exile, he violates it in immigration, regardless of what he writes about, but he also violates it in translation. It's exactly the same pattern for those domains, right? It doesn't seem like Brodsky is the same Brodsky when he translates Auden, right? Because in that case, he chooses not to imitate Auden's rhythm in, for example, in Stop All the Clocks. But that case is interesting because Auden uses a meter that is very Russian, and he uses Dolnik, which is very, very reminiscent of how Russian poets wrote, especially in the early 20th century, but also in Brodsky's own time. So this is a case of non-transfer, and I won't talk much about it. Anyway, so getting back to this question, is translation the same as stylization? I worked on another case, and that's Boris Slutsky, where this is the exact opposite of Brodsky. Slutsky, the translator, seems very different from Slutsky, the poet. Just like Brodsky, Slutsky liked to violate metrical rules and swallow syllables sometimes, disrupt the meters, especially he would do it when he described pain, when he described screaming, when he described that something stands out. I mean, it was all very much iconic, and the meter was imitating what he wrote about. But when he translated from Yiddish, and there is a poet that he translated, Leib Kvitko, he didn't do it. He was completely regular. This probably, I still have to research this more. Leib Kvitko was a Yiddish poet who was executed in 1952 after Stalin's infamous persecution of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. And the poem Slutsky was translating was an instance of a kind of a hidden message where there was a hidden biblical reference. The poem seemed Soviet, the poem seemed to glorify the regime, but there was a kind of a hidden message in it that had to do with using some of the biblical discourse. And not only did Slutsky erase all of this in the translation, but he made it this perfectly iambic meter without any disruptions or deviations, even though screams were mentioned in that poem, and you would expect him to use some of those rhythmical figures, but he did not. And I suppose he was very careful, I mean, having lived through that era and witnessed so many persecutions that he escaped himself, he was willing to maybe do risky things for himself, right? And write risky poems and hide them in the drawer. But he was extra careful when he was translating others. Anyway, what I presented here are kind of two cases, like mirror images of each other. Brodsky, who is similar as to his own style in translations, similar to his stylizations. Slutsky, who is the exact opposite. Now, do I have like 2 minutes to finish?
Sure. I'm just a bit afraid we might not have enough time for questions. We can run over a little bit. We can run over. We start a bit late. We can run over by 5-10 minutes. But it would be nice to have a bit of time for the audience also to.
I'll finish
ask some questions
in a second. So, getting back to this question, can stylistic characteristics be transferred from language to language? One thing I was working on recently is free verse, and because it's really not a traditionally Russian form, of course, you have to look at foreign examples of it. And I looked at the Lenore Goralik's free verse, which I found to be incredibly structured, although, of course, it's not rhymed. It doesn't have any of those traditional features, even sporadically. I noticed that she places certain words at the beginning of paragraphs, and the text is highly structured and is very reminiscent of Native American narratives, which are structured along the same lines, very reminiscent of biblical Hebrew narratives. And the question I asked myself when I worked on this, and when I worked on those other instances like Pushkin with his no clash constraint, is, do we always have to look at influence and assume it's there? Or should we perhaps in this day and age also look at cases which may not be connected due to influence, but may be an instance of typological similarity? And I think, to me, that seems like an interesting line of research to explore who is similar in the world, even if influence didn't happen directly. Anyway, I'm done.
Thank you so much, Nila. That's really great. And I'm just checking here if anybody's raising their hand. So for the audience, because we're using the webinar format for this roundtable, you cannot unfortunately turn your cameras, but you can either use the Q&A function to ask a question, and you can indicate which panelists you'd like to answer it. And you can also raise your hands and I can allow you to talk. There's a button called allow to talk. I'm not being, yeah, so you can use either way. So just think about any questions. And in the meantime, I would invite the panelists, if you'd like to, if you have any comments, having heard the other two panelists, to maybe follow up or pick up any threads that have been identified by the others.
Nila, it's a strange coincidence. I wasn't aware until this morning of Brodsky's intervention into the Russian-Ukrainian cultural debate, but this morning, as I was walking to work, I listened to a podcast from a French radio, and they mentioned this. They actually mentioned that Brodsky has been commandeered in this cultural aspect of the war. I'm not entirely sure that by using the statistical methods and the analysis from the point of view of the semantic aura, it is possible to say whose Brodsky is. I wouldn't even venture into that category, whose he is. However, I do find that Michael Wachtel's explanation of the transfer, especially not from French, but from German poetic practices into Russian poetic practices in late 18th, early 19th century, particularly in terms of the balladic verse, right, the amphibrachts, and the German adaptation of such Latin forms as the dactyls and their subsequent adaptation into Russian point to the impossibility, actually, of borrowing rather than reworking. So at least the way that Michael Wachtel and before him Gasparov showed that such attempted uses of foreign forms in poetry were not really borrowings so much as they were creative reworkings. And we cannot even speak about translation in this case, let alone influence.
Oh, can I reply? So I think that when you borrow a whole meter, it's quite easy to hear, especially in terms of amphibrachts, right? Ta 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 ta. It's very easy to pick. A non-linguist or a non-literary scholar may not know what it's called, but it's very striking. But what I was talking about is the borrowing of very subtle things, right? Very subtle tendencies in where you place stresses. You may not even be aware you're doing it, but if you read enough, right, and have this sense that another language stresses a certain position more, you may incorporate this into your own writing without knowing it. And your reader may not even be able to see it right away, but just have this weird sense that something is off, right? So I do believe that we can transfer certain features, but it would be incomplete simply because the Russian language, as I showed, doesn't allow you to match those numbers directly because we have longer words. But some level of transfer, I believe, is possible, especially with those kind of low-level features that are not easy to detect.
Brian, would you like to add anything? Maybe?
I'm not a specialist in that. I don't translate
About
poetry.
anything at all.
Yeah, like Nila's, the final point in her talk was, I think, very important because a lot of people get caught up on influence from a specific author and so on, but that there are waves of influence and things. So in the previous panel, we were talking about Hemingway, and, that was already part of a modernist style. I mean, certainly certain features are more emphasized in Hemingway, but yeah, to always balance between specific bearers of this style, and often there are strong writers who are bearers of stylistic innovation, but also to recognize that there are transnational movements that bring stylistic borrowings in a more general, dispersed way, maybe I would say.
Right, and I think the scholar that worked on that a lot, who may not be known in the West, he worked in Kazakhstan, and that's Zhovtis, right? He was looking at those cross-cultural patterns that may not result from influence, and he insisted that this is interesting, right? We need to study how the human mind creates poetry, and it doesn't matter if there was a direct influence of A on B or B on A, right? So that was my point with Garalik's poem, but also I think it's really applicable to any case of, similarity that we discuss. And we may feel stuck sometimes. Did this influence happen or not, right? And go through biographies and look for data on biography, but maybe we don't always have to do that.
I guess the thing is also with Russian literature, especially, it's so axiomatic for many that Russian literature has been influenced by the Western canon and vice versa, and it's often easier to accept it as the narrative, and I think most of us do, but much harder to kind of pin down, apart from some biographical sort of details, how it actually happens. And I guess one question here would be to think about which stylistic features actually can be sort of transposed from one language to another and remain intact. Like we talked about repetition in the earlier panel, for example. You can sort of see if you repeat in one language, you can also repeat in another. Some metrical features maybe belong to that kind of stylistic features and some don't. Whereas potentially other aspects of style may be too intricately bound with a given language to be transferred. But then what happens when a writer tries to, is impressed by such features and does something in their own work that, reflects them, but maybe cannot necessarily transfer them directly, or doesn't want to, or maybe it's not even doable. So there's a lot of complex issues there that, I feel like we're just at the beginning of the discussion, really. If anybody wants to follow up, please do.
Just to tie something into the previous panel on influence, someone had mentioned Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha, and in fact, this rendition, this original work, was based on new philological work on Icelandic sagas. So he thought he would compose a saga for indigenous people in the US based on what he thought was probably transnational features of sagas across cultures. So again, I think to Nila's point, the notion of typology and its relationship to specific influence, it's very murky, and it takes a lot of different paths, I would say.
And some of you have mentioned also modernism, and that's another I guess, area where Leonid has written on modernism, of course, and just another. In this conference, we've identified or focused on translation and on multilingualism as our main kind of case studies of studies of border crossings, so to speak. But of course, there are many others. Influence would be, influence taken sort of generously defined would be one such area, but also international literary movements such as modernism. I mean, Leonid wrote entitled his book "In Search of Russian Modernism." I don't know if you found it, but again, that's another maybe rich area to think about in this context.
Eugenia, just a little aside. In my experience, the more I study this problem, the more I am reluctant to even use that term influence, because there are so many filters, cultural filters, linguistic filters, historical, political, social filters that stand, and of which we're not necessarily aware, stand between a supposedly model text and the emulating text, that it would probably be more correct to speak not of influence, but adaptation or some kind of a dialogue. Or borrowing is all right, but borrowing, when we borrow an amount of money, it's in our pocket. But what's left in the text that we treat as having borrowed from some other text is not at all the same amount. And very often, the currency is counterfeit. So that, and especially with modernism, because every 10 to 15 years in the Russian modernist cultural experience, there is a desire to say we were wrong. What we took for a Western model is what we invented for ourselves, and we convinced ourselves that this is a Western model, this or that. It's like clockwork. Every 12, 13 years, you have this kind of pushback. No, say around 1910, Russian poets, actually we invented French symbolism. There was no such thing. Then in the early 20s, when there is the Serapion group, Serapion brothers, they invent essentially what they call a Western narrative, which a few years later, all of them say, no, it wasn't Western at all, because we cannot even find suitable examples in the West. And it will be the same thing in the 30s, by the mid 30s. So those are, if you will, distinct problems. There is indeed a case to be made about specific instances of influence. But there is also very often this notion of influence is abused. It is applied to cases where you actually have a debate, where you have polemical appropriation, where you have rewriting, which we call all of it, we place under the blanket of influence.
No, absolutely. I mean, I completely agree that it's a loaded term and a difficult one in many instances. And I think we could have named this roundtable trying to figure out what happens behind the narratives of influence that we have. It would just be a bit long. I'm not sure if adaptation is the best term either, to be honest. Transfer, maybe to some extent, but does it capture everything? Or narratives of transfer, perhaps. I don't know. Influence is something that anybody can understand, even if it's problematic, and maybe it's interesting to discuss. I mean, it's provocative in a sense because it's problematic, and therefore potentially it goes beginning to a conversation. And I think it's the conversation that we're after here.
I like the term dialogue.
Which term? Sorry?
Leonid's term dialogue instead of influence. And I also liked what you described when something assumed to be influence is not even there, right? And it reminded me of the movie Stilyagi, when I don't know if you watched it, where a group of young people dress
when they imagine American culture, yes.
But they imagine American culture, and then one of them becomes a diplomat and comes back and says, "Stiliak tam нет."
Well, in the case of Russian literary history, the most glaring example is Zenida Vengerova's long article published in the late 19th century, the French symbolists, which essentially creates French symbolism. Because at this time in France, no one was speaking about symbolism. She invents French symbolism for Russian consumption. And then when Russians go to the West, they're extremely disappointed that they cannot find it. So that when Brusov in the mid 1900s travels to Paris and he is actively looking for French symbolist poets, no one knows what he's talking about.
That's fascinating.
And Lotman mentions that virtually none of the so-called Westernizers in early 19th century Russia traveled to the West, and it was mostly the Slavophiles who had spent time there. So yes, it was always to quote Yurchak, imaginary Wests or other cultures, imaginary elsewheres. Yeah.
And of course, there's also a whole dialogue out there and to be conducted about, the imaginary Russia in Western literature, imaginary Dostoevsky via French translations, imaginary Gogol, imaginary Pushkin, especially given the difficulties with translations of Russian poetry, especially, and certain peculiarities of Russian writers' styles in other languages. We should probably be wrapping up shortly to leave some time for our closing remarks. Anybody from the audience, if anybody wants to ask sort of a closing question, this will be a chance. Is not? All right. Well, thank you so much, all the three speakers. It's been really fascinating, and thank you for joining the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you for your contributions, and I hope this is the beginning of a conversation rather than just the end of a conference or a round table. And
Thank you so much.
it's a little bit awkward to transition from one event to the closing remarks, but basically we'll just take a few minutes, Duncan and I, to just say a couple of things to thank everyone, first of all, for attending, for your much appreciated perseverance in staying for 2 days, despite many difficulties in time zones and personal schedules and so on and so forth. Had close to 300 registrations, and including the speakers and everyone else. And people have, as was the idea, kind of picked and chosen different panels. It's been really wonderful. We had people from all over the world, just to read a few: Turkey, India, Poland, Czech Republic, Tunisia, Norway, Sweden, Belgium, the Philippines, Greece, Mexico, Russia, Ukraine, Belgium, and of course a lot of participants from the UK. So thank you again, everybody, for being here. Thank you especially to the relatively invisible team behind Duncan and myself, who has labored day and night to make this possible. The BCLT manager, Anne Good, and Lily Olden, and Sam Foster, our tech support, Martin Waters. Really, we could not have done this without you, and it would never have run as smoothly. We had barely any hiccups, and that's absolutely wonderful. I guess one important thing to also mention is, well, two important things. One is we've been a bit careful about sort of announcing that there will be recordings of these conversations, but there will be recordings. We have not lost them. We're afraid they might just sort of disappear at some point from the cloud. They're there. So everybody who's registered, or if you didn't register officially on Eventbrite, but you'd like to access recordings, write to me and I'll give you that access. We have the access, so we have the cloud storage until the 1st of April. So this is an opportunity for you to, especially if you missed something because you had a conflicting event, you had to, it was night where you are, you can then go and re-listen to something, catch up on something you missed, and just do it before the 1st of April, because after that we will have to delete the recordings for both sort of reasons of personal privacy and for reasons of just practical reasons. Some of the plenaries will be also very shortly uploaded to the BCLT YouTube channel. So then please come and watch, and also share the links with any colleagues you feel could have benefited from those events. They'll live on. And we will think about the publication. We had a lot of wonderful papers, many more than we had anticipated. This was meant to be a much smaller event originally. We didn't plan 3 panel streams at all times. We just had too many really good papers to not to restructure the event accordingly. So if you're interested in participating in a collective volume, again, get in touch. We will think about this, and we'll get in touch in due course as well. I see questions about a certificate. We're not planning to issue certificates as a kind of to everyone, but if you personally would like a certificate, just get in touch, and we will issue a certificate from BCLT and the center. Yes, on this note, I'll hand over to Duncan for a couple of closing remarks, and we'll call it a day, or we'll call it a 2 days. And thank you again, everybody. This has been a really wonderful event.
Thank you, Eugenia. It's getting late, so I have a very few remarks. I've been thinking about metaphors, thinking about the metaphor in the title of the event. Stylistic border crossings invites us to think spatially. Leonid's metaphor about borrowing and counterfeit currency towards the end of our previous panel. I wanted to introduce another metaphor, which is that of the feast. I think it's been a real feast these last couple of days. I really wanted just to echo Eugenia's thanks to all of our speakers, to our plenary speakers, to our panelists, and to all who've taken part and been in the audience and asked questions, and to all our panel chairs as well. Eugenia already mentioned our supporters at BCLT, at the East Center, at UEA. So there's one person, though, who hasn't been thanked so far, and really it's my job. I have one job now, and that's to thank Eugenia. Eugenia has been the driving force behind this event all along. We've been hosting the event with great pleasure at BCLT, but this event was conceived by Eugenia, and it's really thanks to her expertise, to her network, to her talents as an organizer. It's not for nothing that this event grew to be such a substantial event, because it's such a fascinating topic that Eugenia has chosen, and that she herself, the area that she is working in, that has drawn such fascinating papers to make up the event that we've just experienced. So Eugenia, on behalf of BCLT, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for all the effort you've put into organizing this event. I think it's paid off absolutely triumphantly. So thank you, Eugenia, and I hope you can enjoy the weekend. I hope everybody can enjoy your weekend after such a wonderful and a wonderfully intensive 2 days. I think we need a weekend perhaps now, but as Eugenia was saying, I'm sure this is the beginning of many conversations. On behalf of BCLT, and I thank everybody for your participation and look forward to your participation perhaps in future BCLT events and events generally at the University of East Anglia. But I will close there, and unless Eugenia, I should perhaps hand back to Eugenia to close the event, because it's Eugenia's event. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Duncan. It's very, very kind and generous words. And well, I'll definitely need the weekend to think about all the things I've heard and to listen to all the papers I had to miss because I had to be somewhere else. So that's for sure. And I should probably also mention once again that this event has been organized jointly by two centers, by the East Centre with myself as one of the co-directors, but also Francis King as another, and of course BCLT and Duncan Larch. And I hope it's not the last one to be inspired by this very interdisciplinary partnership. And again, thank you, everybody. Without you, there would be no event for sure.